It was the 1st of February, 1943. The Allied bombers were preparing for another mission over North Africa. One of them was a B-17 Flying Fortress from the 414th Bomb Squadron. Its job that morning was to bomb enemy positions near Bizerte, Tunisia, an area still under Axis control. The crew of 10 had done this many times before. They went through the same routine, checking their guns, loading ammunition, testing the radios. The cold morning air was filled with the sound of engines starting one after another. When the 4 engines of the B-17 came to life, the ground shook. At around 9 a.m., they took off and formed up with the other bombers. Everything looked normal in the beginning. The sky was clear, and the sunlight reflected off the wings of dozens of aircraft climbing higher and higher. As they crossed into enemy territory, black bursts of flak began to appear around them. Each explosion sent metal fragments flying through the air. The sound of shrapnel hitting the fuselage was constant. The crew stayed calm and focused, calling out each hit over the intercom. When they reached their target, German fighters began to appear. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs came in fast from above and behind. The B-17's gunners opened fire. The roar of the .50 caliber guns echoed inside the fuselage as the tracer rounds flashed through the sky. On the first pass, a 20mm shell exploded near the tail. The shock threw the tail gunner, Sergeant Samuel Walker, against the side of the turret. His gun fell silent. The other gunners shouted for him, but there was no reply. The tail section was full of holes, and the rear stabilizer was badly damaged. The plane kept flying, but the damage was severe. Parts of the tail were missing completely. The crew could see daylight through the back of the fuselage. Despite this, the pilot, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, managed to keep the aircraft level. The bombardier released the bombs on target, and the crew started to turn back. The B-17 began to lose altitude. The controls were heavy, and the plane felt unstable. Bragg and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Ralph Burbridge, worked together to keep it from rolling. The intercom crackled with static as the crew reported damage, one engine leaking oil, another overheating, the radio only partly working. When Bragg turned around to look, he couldn't believe what he saw. Most of the tail, including the vertical stabilizer, was gone. The rudder controls were completely severed. It was a miracle the plane hadn't broken apart. The crew debated whether to bail out. They were still over hostile territory, and parachuting down meant capture, or worse. Bragg made the decision to stay in the air and try to get back to base. The navigator recalculated their route. They were about 300 miles from their airfield. The weather was clear, but the strong desert winds made the flight even harder. The waist gunners tied themselves down with parachute cords. The open section at the back was sucking out air, and the cold was unbearable. The B-17 was now flying slower than normal, and the vibrations grew stronger every minute. It looked more like a wreck than an aircraft, but somehow it kept going. At one point, 2 German fighters returned and made another pass. They saw the damaged bomber still in the air and opened fire again. Bullets ripped through the fuselage, but the crew fought back, managing to hit one of the attackers. The second fighter broke off, leaving the crippled bomber alone. Inside, the oxygen system had failed. The crew took off their masks and descended to a lower altitude. The smell of burnt oil and gunpowder filled the air. Every control movement felt delayed. The tail section had completely fallen apart, but the plane was still flying straight, barely. Bragg and Burbridge kept their focus on the horizon. Neither spoke much. The crew sat in silence, each man understanding how close they were to not making it back. Below them stretched miles of desert. The engines coughed, the airframe rattled, and yet, somehow, the flying fortress continued to hold together. It was as if the plane itself refused to die. The desert winds howled through the shattered fuselage of the B-17 as it limped through the North African sky. Inside, chaos met silence. Only the rhythmic clanking of loose metal and the faint sputter of dying engines broke the stillness. The crew had done everything humanly possible to save their fortress. But at this point, it seemed the plane itself had taken over. The pilot's seat was empty. Both men who had flown the bomber were gone, either ejected or lost to the chaos. The controls hung useless, the yoke spinning on its own as the B-17 kept its nose straight toward the coast. The surviving crew, dazed and battered, stared in disbelief. The fortress was flying level by itself. Every checklist, every bit of training told them this was impossible. The left wing had been shredded, most of the elevators were gone, and yet the plane didn't dive. They steadied themselves, checking gauges, but most were dead. The compass flickered, the altimeter spun. Even the radio was silent. For several long minutes, the bomber held its course. It drifted lower, engines coughing, still somehow balanced against all odds. The crew braced for the end, clutching at what little remained of their parachutes. Then, as if guided by something unseen, the fortress began to descend, smooth, controlled, almost graceful. On the ground, soldiers at a British airfield near Benghazi spotted a lone aircraft coming in from the east. No response to radio hails, no recognition signals. The tower watched as the bomber lined up with the runway, wheels down. At first, they assumed the crew had gone radio silent, but as the plane drew closer, something was off. The landing gear was uneven. One tire was missing, the flaps half torn, yet the aircraft's glide path was perfect. Slowly, the B-17 touched down, skidding across the runway, sparks showering from the broken landing gear. It rolled for nearly a quarter mile before coming to rest, nose slightly tilted, smoke trailing from its engines. Rescue crews rushed toward it. They expected to find wounded men calling for help, or at least some sign of life inside. But as they climbed into the cockpit, the truth hit them like a cold wave. There was no one there. No pilot. No co-pilot. No movement at all. The seats were empty, belts still fastened. The control yoke was locked straight, the throttles at landing power. The bomber had landed perfectly on its own. One of the British officers at the scene would later recall, it was as if the plane itself refused to die, a ghost with unfinished business. The British ground crew circled the silent B-17 in disbelief. The engine still ticked with cooling heat, faint wisps of smoke rising from bullet holes across the fuselage. It was as if the bomber had returned from another world. The men stepped carefully around the plane's nose, peering into shattered windows and torn aluminum, unable to comprehend how it had landed at all. Inside, the eerie stillness continued. The flight deck was splattered with oil and blood, the instrument panels shattered. Bullet holes ran across the canopy. The navigator's table was still open, the last coordinates scrawled halfway across the page. Coffee cups were overturned, parachute straps hung loose from their hooks. Every sign pointed to a crew that had been there and then suddenly wasn't. Within an hour, Allied intelligence arrived to inspect the aircraft. They confirmed it belonged to the 97th Bomb Group, operating from North Africa. Mission records showed that this particular B-17 tail, number 124,485, had gone missing in action after a raid over Naples. Its crew had been listed as presumed lost. But here it was, completely intact, sitting quietly under the North African sun. Investigators soon pieced together what might have happened. During the return from the raid, the B-17 had taken heavy flak. Both pilots were killed instantly, and the rest of the crew likely bailed out when they believed the bomber was doomed. Yet the damage had locked the throttles and trim controls in a perfect glide configuration, with just enough engine power. The plane maintained altitude, slowly descending until it found the airfield. Still, no one could explain how it lined up so precisely with the runway, or how it managed to lower its landing gear. Some swore they saw faint movements in the cockpit during approach, as if someone invisible were at the controls. Others insisted it was only the wind and luck. The bomber was nicknamed the Ghost Fortress. For months, it stood as a silent legend on the Benghazi airstrip, visited by pilots and engineers from every unit in the region. Many touched its wings for luck before flying missions over Italy. As for the crew, they were later found scattered across the desert, parachutes deployed miles from where the bomber had landed. None of them had survived the bailout. The B-17 that flew home alone was eventually salvaged for parts, but its story never faded. Even years later, veterans would speak of it in hushed tones, a machine that refused to die, a ghost of the war that seemed to carry its own spirit of survival. It remains one of the most haunting mysteries of World War II. The day a flying fortress came home with no crew and no pilot at all.